Get this underway. We're almost... Everyone who's been standing out there waiting in the queue, I think, is now arriving. I see some people saying wait, but they can still hear me even though they're making their way to the seat. Now, in the interlude, while we're waiting for people to leave, I was beginning to tell my cabinet colleagues what the questions looked like and what they were. I can now see them tweeting and blackberrying to make sure they get the right answers. But let's begin. You know, every summer since the Scottish National Party came into government in 2007, what we've done is we've gone around the country every summer with a summer cabinet, from Dumfries to Aberdeen, from Skye to Stranraer, from Fort William to Jedburgh. Why do we do that? Well, we do that because although Holyrood is a fantastic place to do your work, and Edinburgh is the home of the Parliament belongs to all of the people of Scotland. So intentionally we go out every summer and we tour around various parts of Scotland and we take a road show along with us to allow the people in these communities to ask us questions. So we thought we'd try that experiment with the SNP delegates. That could be very, very dangerous. However, as I said earlier, we had lots of questions submitted by people after being asked as delegates to submit questions, and I've pulled them all together in a number of areas to make sure that we cover as many of these areas as possible. So let me start off. Now, who will I choose? This is a great game, this, for me. Can I start with Alec Neil? I think, Alec, the question I have here, it says, I think everyone would agree that we need to invest just now to get the economy moving. What is the Scottish Government doing to make sure that we maximise spending, especially in capital projects, to boost the economy and deliver jobs? And what would the Cabinet Secretary do differently if we had the normal economic powers with independence?
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Bruce. I've been very careful holding that mic not to say anything too much in case there's a Mrs. Duffy in the hall and do a Gordon Brown. Can I first of all say that the first thing to state is that our grant from the UK Treasury for capital has been substantially reduced by £1 billion a year over each of the next 3 years. So the first thing we have had to do is to try to fill that black hole, and through John's tremendous efforts and the work I'm doing, we now have what is called an NPD, not-for-profit distributing programme worth £2.5 billion. And that is being launched as we speak. £1 billion of that money is for transport, £750 million for health, and £750 million for education. The transport projects are primarily the M8 and the Aberdeen Western Peripheral. The education projects are primarily the 3 colleges in Inverness, Glasgow and Kilmarnock and schools. The health projects are primarily the Royal Sick Children's Hospital and a range of other smaller projects throughout the country. On top of that, we're investing £1 billion over the next 3 years in our railways, upgrading the Glasgow to Edinburgh line. We're going to complete the Borders Railway before 2015, and there are a range of other improvements as well. On top of that, we have a very substantial housing investment programme. For example, Keith Brown and I announced before Christmas that we're going to build 4,300 new homes costing £460 million, and that, of course, generates jobs and more investment. On top of that, we have got £500 million a year investment by Scottish Water that we are funding. On top of that, we have a range of other initiatives. John announced the enterprise zones. They will generate masses of private sector investment over the next few years. I announced tax incremental financing projects up to 6 of those across the country, and they will generate hundreds of millions of pounds of public and private sector investment as well. And to bring you bang up to date, we have submitted a programme of shovel-ready projects, as the First Minister said, for the budget a week on Wednesday, totalling well over £300 million and covering right across the whole of Scotland, everything from the smaller projects like Airgate, where I live, to bigger road and other health and education projects as well. I can't go through every single one of them, but I can tell you, if you add it all up and we get that 300 million, despite the massive cut in our budget from Westminster, we will end up either spending or leveraging nearly £12 billion of capital investment over the next 3 years.
Thank you, Alec. The only thing I'm slightly worried about now is there's anyone else left for any of the rest of my colleagues to announce here in terms of what we've done. But Richard Lockhead, EU negotiations over CAP and CFP reform are going to be really important for communities in rural Scotland. Given that we're not independent yet, how is the Cabinet Secretary making sure that Scotland's voice is heard, and what difference will independence make in your job?
Thanks, Bruce. Very pertinent questions, given that this year and into next year is going to see the renegotiation of the Common Agricultural Policy, which is so important to our farmers and our crofters, and the Common Fisheries Policy, which of course is so important to our coastal communities and fishing communities. Well, we've got a distinctive case in both these areas, and in terms of the Common Agricultural Policy, Scotland is very distinct compared to the rest of these islands. So we've got a distinct case to put, different type of land, different sectors, a bigger livestock sector, etc. And of course, past UK governments have negotiated very poor deals for Scotland. Believe it or not, out of the 27 countries at the moment, if you were to treat Scotland as the 28th, we currently get the 4th lowest level of support for our farmers. And in terms of rural development funding, which is also part of CAP at the moment, out of the 27 countries, we're the 28th, we get the lowest in the whole of Europe of rural development funding to help rural communities. So past UK governments have done nothing to negotiate good deals for Scotland. So the first benefit of being independent is we wouldn't have to share our priorities with the rest of these islands. We'd have our own priorities which we'd negotiate and have our own voice at the top table as part of the formal networks, the Council of Ministers, and all the informal things that happen in Europe as well, all the meetings behind the scenes that we're not at, where many of the groundwork takes place, many decisions are taken before it gets into the Council of Ministers. We're absent from a lot of that. The UK won't even let us attend when they can't make it, and that's the way we're treated at the moment. So we're doing what we can at the moment to negotiate good deals for our farmers and fishermen. We attend all Council of Ministers. We make sure we're breathing down the shoulders of the UK ministers who want to say things which are against Scotland's interests. Sometimes we stop them doing that because we're in the same room. And of course, we're building relationships up with other member states of Europe, the European Commission and the presidencies when they take the chair of each Council of Ministers as well. So we're punching way above our weight just now, and that's why we've managed to influence negotiations over the next Common Agricultural Policy in particular, and the Common Fisheries Policy. Clearly, we'd have much rather the UK were negotiating, trying to get out of the Common Fisheries Policy. They've refused to do that, so what we're trying to do is decentralise it as much as possible and get decision-making back to Scotland as much as possible for our coastal communities and fishing communities. The final point I'll just make in this wider debate is, in my 5 years of attending Council of Ministers in Brussels and Luxembourg, I can't recall one occasion where the UK have cast a vote because of a Scottish issue. So don't listen to any of this nonsense Scotland about it's much better being a part of a bigger member state. It's not any better being part of a bigger member state when they never speak up for your interests or make your interests a priority.
Thank you, Richard. Now a question for Mike Russell. Some of the other parties are now calling on us to delay the curriculum for excellence. What does the Cabinet Secretary say to that?
You mean apart from no? What I say is this: the curriculum for excellence has been in preparation for 8 years. I was part of the Education Committee in Parliament's Education Committee in 2002, that undertook an inquiry into the purposes of Scottish education. There was also a great debate on education in 2002, and both those groups of people came to the same conclusion, which was that Scottish education, as the Scottish Parliament inherited it, was too compartmentalised, was over-examined, was over-inspected, wasn't deep enough, and needed to change. And there was a cross-party agreement that Scottish education needed to improve for the 21st century. And the response to that was Curriculum for Excellence. And across the parties, we agreed that it should commence, that it should move forward. We didn't know that, unfortunately, Labour education ministers, and particularly one Hugh Henry, would do hee-haw, if I may use that phrase, in the time they were in office to take it forward. So when Fiona took over in 2007, there was an awful lot of catching up to be done. But Fiona and then myself have worked very hard with our officials across government, with all the agencies, with schools, with teachers, with local authorities to get this to work. And we've done so because this is the best thing we could possibly do. This transforms Scottish education. It means that Scottish education is relevant to every child. And if you had any doubt about how good this was, I wish I could take people who don't go into schools regularly into schools to see what it's like. 2 weeks ago, I was in a school in Clydebank, and one of the things that struck me, and I'm in schools every 2 or 3 times a week, but one of the things that struck me there suddenly was this. When I was at school, I didn't understand why I was learning things. I was quite good at remembering, and we were all probably quite good at remembering, but I hadn't a Scooby about why I was learning what I was learning. Now, go into schools now and learn from children of every age, and they know what they're learning and why they're learning. They can connect learning up. They're learning much more deeply than we ever learned at school. And they're taking that forward into creating the type of Scotland even better than the one we're trying to create now. If we delay, if we hold back, I can understand that for some people that's a safe option, but it's putting off the benefit for those children, because there are 54,000 children in S2 at the moment, and we've promised them that they will be the first cohort through. And imagine if we suddenly said to them, no, sorry, we're holding you back. You're not getting here. We're not going to do that. We're going to help and resource and support any teacher or any school that still needs help, and we're going to make sure we do this properly, because the future of Scotland depends upon it. And our job is to create that better Scotland. So that was a long way of saying, no, we're going to do it properly. We're going to support Scottish teachers to do it. And as a nation and as individual children, there's huge benefit to be reaped from it.
Thank you, Mike. That now explains to me when we got to calculus, and I thought, why am I doing this? I'm glad you've explained that for me. Thank you very much. Now, a question for Fiona Hislop. It's been long-standing party policy to spend 0.7% of our GDP on international aid. Will this be a priority for you in an independent Scotland, Fiona?
Yes, indeed. I mean, this party's record on international development, its commitment is long and strong. In fact, 25 years ago, when I joined this party, one of the reasons was I knew the commitment to international development. So undoubtedly, that's going to be very much part and parcel of the type of independent Scotland we'll be projecting. It's not just about what's in independence for us. It's actually about what we as a country can contribute internationally. Now, the transition from the current position to then implement that will be something we'll have to take responsibly. We'll have to work in cooperation with DFID and others, but that will be our commitment, and we can continue that. And if it's a mark of this party, and it's a mark of our government, that despite the cuts from Westminster, collectively as a cabinet, we agreed to maintain our International Development Fund of £9 million in this budget. And a challenge to you all, sport relief is coming up. You might not be aware, but even under the current powers that we have, we've managed to, just as Alec Neil has been leveraging money in for capital investment, we've got a partnership with sport relief. The days are coming up where you can celebrate and contribute. And they've agreed to match the International Development Fund funding of £1.5 million by matching that with sport relief money by £1.5 million. So we are going to move our International Development Fund currently of 9 million up to a value of 10.5, and they're committed to invest that internationally on projects agreed with Scotland. So even now we're showing our commitment, and I'm sure you're all going to get your running shorts on and make sure that we can increase that capacity and that involvement. But that commitment's there. It's something I'm very proud of, but it's important that we send that message. Independence is not just about what we can do in Scotland, it's what we can do internationally, and I'm sure I've got the support of the party in taking that forward.
Thank you, Fiona. I think the days of me in running shorts are probably well gone. John Swinney, we're hearing a lot about Scotland's renewable potential. Does John Swinney agree with the First Minister? He probably better.
Well,
when he says that we have hit the energy natural lottery for the second time with renewables, and what is the Scottish Government going to do to promote the industry?
well, of course I agree with the First Minister. I almost said that without knowing what the question was, but we've nailed our colours very firmly to the mast of renewables, and we did it when we came into office in 2007, and I think one of the worst things you can do in government is do what the previous executive did and what the UK government is doing, is sort of say that you're committed to renewables and then give off the record briefings which says, well, actually we're not really that enthusiastic about it and we wouldn't mind a bit of nuclear into the bargain. That's not where we are. We nailed our colours to the mast of renewables and we have unrelentingly stuck to that, and it's exactly the right thing to do. Why? Because it gives us a sustainable access to an energy resource. And energy is going to be one of the key commodities that will determine the economic futures of countries in the years to come. And Scotland was very fortunate to discover North Sea oil and gas reserves. We have not seen the benefit of that in Scotland in the fashion we would have seen if our country had become independent earlier than we are going to become independent. And the renewables opportunity is enormous in a number of respects in terms of energy generation from onshore wind, offshore wind, wave and tidal and other sources, but also because of the opportunities it gives us to essentially redevelop and recreate the industrial and manufacturing opportunities of new devices that can give us strong manufacturing opportunities in the years to come. And I think one of the things which is most encouraging about this is that we've managed to create a real sense of common purpose between our enterprise agencies, our universities, our colleges, private sector engineering companies and other development interests, and particularly with renewables developers, to make Scotland a leading place in which renewables can be developed and we can seize these opportunities. So I think we're looking at a tremendously exciting economic opportunity, and we saw that evidenced in two things in the course of the last 48 hours. On Thursday, the United Kingdom government agreed that the Green Investment Bank would be in Edinburgh. Why? Because it's the most appropriate place to be because of the intensity of renewables activity that's underway in Scotland. And secondly, yesterday, Burcote Wind announced £1 billion worth of investment in renewables energy in Scotland. Now that is a tremendous boost on top of all the other renewables investments that we've had in Scotland. So it says to me that Scotland has a tremendous energy opportunity through renewables, and the government's absolutely committed to making it happen.
Thank you, John. Kenny, a lot of the anti-social behaviour in our towns is drink-related. What more can we do to tackle the booze culture and break the link between drink and crime?
Well, there's two aspects here. There is the question of offending and the question of alcohol abuse, but I think as the question implies, there's a clear link there. As I was saying at the Victim Support Scotland Fringe, our police do an excellent job. We've got a 35-year low in recorded crime. Homicides are still down significantly from what they were a decade ago. Progress is being made, but a policeman's job is made significantly harder because of actions that occur, sometimes through stupidity, sometimes deliberate, but fueled by alcohol. And I said there that when I first came into the job, if you'd said to me what's the major problem in causing people to go into Corton Vale, you'd have said heroin. Now the Governor will tell you it's actually alcohol. Even amongst the women, alcohol is supplanting drugs. It's a significant problem. So we have to address it because the crime rate in Scotland would come down significantly. Over 50% of those murdered or who commit a murder are under the influence of alcohol. It's probably significantly more than that, but that's only the ones that we can get the toxicology for. You go to Parliament young offenders, as I do, and 3/4 or more will say, it wasn't the drink that did it, but if they hadn't been drunk, they wouldn't have done it. As I said at the Victim Support Conference, the hardest part of my job is to meet the victims of crime and to express the sorrow, and you feel quite inadequate meeting parents whose son has been murdered or whatever. Equally, though, I remember being in Parliament and meeting a young man who actually perpetrated a very serious offence. And I remember that young man saying to me, he didn't carry a knife routinely. He didn't run with a gang. But he was at a party, in the kitchen, an argument flared. If he could roll back time, he wouldn't have consumed the amount of drink he did. He wouldn't have picked up the knife. But instead he's got to do the time and he'll be leaving Parliament to go on to prison because of the seriousness of the offence. I don't think he's really bad as such. He's got to face the consequences of his action. But alcohol was behind that, as it is behind so much low-level offending. So we have to change. But I think the answer to the question is also contained within it, because it's a culture. We're taking action on pricing. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party correctly paid a price at the last election because of their shameless actions on minimum pricing. But we now welcome the conversion of the Prime Minister to minimum pricing, and the Deputy First Minister will drive through the alcohol bill because there is a clear link between pricing and indeed consumption. But it's not just pricing, it's promotion. We've taken action on that. We've got to address availability, accessibility as much as affordability, and we'll look at reviewing licensing. And we will take action because there's further steps that have to be taken. Equally, at the end of the day, this is a culture in Scotland. We have to look at ourselves. Individuals have to take a long look at themselves. We're not prohibitionists as a government. I made it quite clear and confessed at the Victim Support Conference. I'd been out last night with a pal. I hadn't seen him since my 50th birthday. He was back from Australia, and we were all catching up, and we had a good time. But I can remember having a good time. And actually, that's the problem that we face. There was a time you used to save up for your New Year bottle. There was a time that you went out and had a right good night and got Oncafu, but you could remember what you did. We now have a culture that's sadly jumped from lads to lassies. You don't change a culture overnight. You do have to have legislation. You do have to bring in actions on both how alcohol is priced and how it's promoted, and we will not hesitate to do that. Equally, Scotland has to take a long, hard look at itself. There are things that we are rightly proud of in terms of what we do and where we stand in European leagues, on universities or whatever. It shouldn't be where we stand in terms of cirrhosis of the liver figures. So I think there's got to be a cultural change. I think we've reached a tipping point in Scotland. I think we now realise that it ain't funny anymore. We can't go on as we are. Alcohol is there to be enjoyed, but when it's abused, the consequences can be catastrophic. So that culture won't change immediately. It will take a good few years, but I do think that we've reached the bottom of the glass and realised that actually we've got to change. It ain't funny, and that means not just in terms of people changing their own individual behaviour, and I'll be much more moderate tonight when I go out with my friends than perhaps last night, but I think it means as a country we've also got to realise that some of the jokes that we even make and how we see ourselves, it's no longer funny, and we've got to change that culture. But you've got a commitment from the government, whether in pricing, whether it's in promotion, we'll be taking action. We won't hesitate to do so. Equally, it's up to each and every one of us to change Scotland for the better.
Thank you, Kenny McCaskill. We'll now go back to Mike Russell. Scotland's universities got one of the best financial settlements in the spending review. What are we going to do to make sure we get value for our money in higher education? Mike.
I think it's a very important question, and the decision to make sure that Scottish universities were properly funded was one that we required to take and did take. Because if we'd allowed a gap to open up between north and south of the border, it would have been greatly to the disadvantage of those institutions which you heard Alex say. 5 in the world's top 200, 8 in the world's top 400, a quite unique situation for a small country. And we need to keep our cutting edge in universities and in university research. So the decision was made deliberately. The universities are capable of taking forward that world-beating agenda, but they do have to recognise they are accountable to the public in terms of the public purse, and that accountability requires and demands a level of transparency that sometimes hasn't been there. Now, I set up 2 reviews of governance, one for further education, one for higher education. Both have reported. The higher education one by Ferdinand von Pronzinski, the principal of Robert Gordon's and a small group, has been very positive. It's also a beautifully written report, by the way. If you sometimes, as ministers, we all feel this sometimes, you get really sometimes piles of stuff that's difficult to read. If you want to read something that's very impressive and very persuasive, read Ferdinand's report on higher education, what its purpose is and how it should be governed. I take the recommendations very seriously. I'm in discussion with the sector about them, and they will work their way through into legislation. I think it is fair to say that the majority of the recommendations have been welcomed by the university sector itself, including recommendations on the setting of principals' pay, which is an issue. Some principals have undoubtedly gone too far, or their boards have. There is one area of contention, which is the issue of elected chairs of university courts, which we will discuss and debate. But I think we will end up with a sector that does reflect that Scottish democratic intellect, which is at the heart of our world-beating success in higher education. We are a thinking and a learning nation. The whole education is in our DNA. We were the country that founded the idea of compulsory education through schools. Our university sector has been of importance to us since the 15th and 16th centuries. We have a huge amount to base our future success on, but at the very heart of it is a system that is free to all, that education is based upon the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. So with that as the foundation, with the funding that we put in place, with the rejection of the monetarisation of higher education, which incidentally I should say to people is not unique. Throughout the world, more and more countries are saying we've gone in the wrong direction. Even the United States is now looking at some of the ways in which education has been monetarised and saying it's been against the interests of intellectual diversity. So with those things in place, and the universities playing a cooperative and collaborative role within Scottish society with the government, we have a sector that will go from strength to strength.
Thank you, Mike. Richard, a question here. The food and drink industry is a big employer in my area. What's the Scottish Government doing to promote the industry, especially exports?
Great subject, and it's going up. It's been a big employer in every area of Scotland. In fact, the food and drink industry was a major employer in Scotland before we came to office in 2007. Do you know how much the food and drink industry has grown by since we were elected to office in 2007? 25%. We should be very proud of our food and drink sector. It's outperforming its counterparts in the rest of these islands. I think it's the biggest economic performer in Scotland, just about out of all our sectors in this country. It's booming as we speak. The demand for Scottish produce in Scotland, across these islands, across Europe, and as I'll come on to the rest of the world, is going through the roof. Sales of Scottish brands in Scotland, England and Wales has increased by 1/3 just in the last 4 years alone. This is a major, major success story, and we've now got a fantastic reputation throughout the world for quality, for a pristine image thanks to our natural environment in Scotland, and of course we've got the best farmers, crofters, fishermen you can get anywhere as well. So this is a huge economic success story as well as really good for Scotland's image. And in terms of exports, well, the export barrier, our figures broke the £1 billion barrier last year for the first time. £1 billion worth of food exports, which again is phenomenal success. Whisky exports, in moderation, have broken the exports barrier by £3.5 billion worth of whisky exports going around the world, with a little bit of Scotland in every bottle. So this is a huge success story. We started off our national food and drink policy a few years ago when we came into office, because we saw all this untapped potential, and we really should be proud of all our producers in Scotland. The industry is doing remarkably well. It is a huge, huge Scottish success story.
Thank you, Richard. Given that we're in Glasgow, I think we better probably have a question about Edinburgh. So Fiona, we're all really proud of Edinburgh festivals. Is there more we can do to make sure they remain world class? And is there a diversity of Scottish productions on show?
In terms of the value, the Edinburgh Festivals generate £250 million to the Scottish economy. But I'm very pleased to say that during this week, last week, together with the festival champion Steve Carr-Downey, the SNP group leader in Edinburgh, we launched a £3.2 million package to help promote particularly the expertise and the talent, Scottish talent, to showcase the world. But I'm delighted that since we are in Glasgow, you had the commitment from SNP Councillor Steve Carr-Downey from Edinburgh to help champion Glasgow and the Commonwealth Games in 2014 to make sure the cultural offering in Scotland for 2014 is something that is shared not just in Glasgow but across Scotland. But an important point in the question is, how do we get talent showcased? We've got a very good programme as part of the Edinburgh Festivals called Made in Scotland. It's funded from the Scottish Government's Expo Fund. It gets the best of Scottish homegrown new talent, particularly in theatre and stage, showcased at the festival and then beamed across the world in tourist and touring opportunities. We're looking to expand that into other areas, whether it's music, etc. But we have the most fantastic opportunity between this year, Year of Creative Scotland, leading right up into 2014, and Homecoming in 2014 with the Commonwealth Games. The world will be welcomed. We'll be welcoming the world in Scotland in those years, and what better way to tell our story and showcase our talent than through creativity. And we'll be doing that in the Edinburgh Festivals, but importantly we'll be doing that right across Scotland to make sure we can have a fantastic demonstration of our cultural story when the world comes in 2014.
Thank you, Fiona. John, it's another question for yourself. We keep hearing that it's a priority to promote growth and get folk back into work. I know the Scottish Government's financial powers are pretty limited, but what's the SNP doing to get the economy moving again?
There are a whole range of different interventions that we're making. Alec set out on capital investment, one of the main elements of our approach, which is, we firmly believe that in the absence of private sector capital availability, which is a real problem, the public sector has to, and also in absence of private sector confidence, the public sector has to step into the breach. That's what we've been doing since 2008, and some of the programmes that Alex brought forward on housing and the acceleration of some of the investment has been about doing all of that. The innovative finance devices, whether it's the non-profit distributing model or the National Housing Trust, help to boost our capital programme. And of course, just on Monday, I was at the Finance Ministers' meeting, the United Kingdom Finance Ministers' meeting, pressing again for the UK Government to expand capital investment resources available to us to give a boost to job creation within Scotland. So the capital expenditure programme is one very important element. The next element is about ensuring that we've got all of the interventions available for skills development and educational development. So the range of provision, whether it's, as the First Minister set out earlier on this afternoon, the guarantee of opportunity for all 16 to 19-year-olds of a guaranteed training or education place is fundamental. The 25,000 modern apprenticeships is another component in the process. And then the strong funding settlement for universities and colleges is, again, a further part of that process. So there's the skills development area. The final part of it is that ministers spend a great deal of time working with individual companies and with international investors to ensure that we can create good job creation opportunities in Scotland. We have to intervene in situations that are quite difficult. Last night, Fergus Ewing was dealing with the a better news story on employment, where a company that had gone into administration, the government's been giving them active support, and they've now come out of administration and been purchased by a third party, and jobs will be saved as a consequence of that. We're always heavily involved in negotiations and discussions about trying to attract investment into Scotland, and later on, we've talked about First Minister's visits to China. I'm going to Japan in April, and Japan and Korea, to reinforce some of our relationships with companies like Samsung and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, to encourage their investment into our country. So there's those three different levels about capital expenditure, skills development, and encouraging investment in Scotland. We're very active. Where we, of course, are limited is that we don't always get the financial return for some of the interventions that we make. If you take a modern apprenticeship, for example, if we get somebody onto a modern apprenticeship, that costs the Scottish Government money, but the savings in benefits don't come to us. They sit with the UK Government. So, we're doing the UK Government a favour. Now, obviously, if we have a full range of financial powers through independence, on that question, we would be able to get the savings and benefits, and we'd also get the tax that would come from the individual going into employment as a consequence of modern apprenticeships. And on the capital expenditure, we could take decisions about the appropriate level of borrowing and the investment in the economy versus deficit reduction. So I want to assure conference that we do everything we can to utilise all of our existing responsibilities to the maximum. And our direction as ministers from the First Minister is absolutely crystal clear. We've got to go after opportunities. We've got to make sure that everything is done to land investment into the Scottish economy. But there is a great deal more we could do if we had a broader range of financial powers to put Scotland at a competitive advantage and to encourage us to get the benefit of some of these policy initiatives that we take to get people back into work, but where we currently don't get the rewards in terms of taxation.
Thank you, John. We'll come to the last question now, but it's certainly not the least important question. It's certainly an issue that affects many rural areas. And Alec, we've got 3 minutes. That's usually, I hope that's not a task for you. The question is, what are we going to do to invest in broadband? I live in a rural area, and it would make a huge difference to my business. And I can see some of the Stirling candidates for the council elections already smiling. Alec, over to you.
Alec, you've got 3 minutes, means that you don't talk too much. 3 weeks ago, we published our broadband infrastructure investment plan, and that set 2 objectives. First of all, by 2015, to ensure that 90% of Scotland is covered and got access to superfast broadband, and by 2020, to ensure that superfast broadband in Scotland is up to the world best and is world class, and we intend to achieve those objectives. We've identified over £200 million for that investment of public money, and we will be intending to use that money to leverage substantial additional private sector investment in the rural areas. And let me say, all of this is really for rural Scotland, because we will only be investing in those areas that are not going to be invested in by the private sector, which by and large will be urban Scotland. We also have got access to 2 other funds. There is the Mobile Broadband Fund at UK level worth £150 million, and we await the UK's decision on how that money is going to be allocated, but we are fighting to get more than our fair share of that. And also £100 million was announced in the November autumn statement by the Chancellor for a investment in broadband in the 4 capital cities of the UK plus 6 other cities. Now, the only other city that meets the criteria that they've set out for that money is Glasgow. I've written to the Chancellor to ask him to widen the criteria for future rounds so that cities like Inverness and Perth and Aberdeen and Stirling can actually get some of that money in addition to our own money. Finally, I've got a meeting coming up with Mr. Jeremy Hunt who is the Secretary of State for Culture in London, to demand a bigger share of the BBC licence money than what we got. The Welsh get £58 million from that money. We only get £68 million, and he told me that we had the highest amount per head, and I suggested that he redo his maths. So we have been at him since then to get a much higher share of that money. They've now conceded that we did not get our fair share, and I have a meeting with them fairly soon, I think, in London, to make sure that we get our fair share of that money as well.
Thank you, delegates. Thank you to my Cabinet Secretary colleagues. We're all trying to do something slightly new at conference. There's another new thing in the agenda this year, so I hope it was worthwhile for you. They certainly were able to answer a broad range of questions, genuinely put by the conference delegates. So can we have one last round of applause for our Cabinet Secretaries? And I see the business convener looking at me, so I better hand the microphone back to him. Thank you very much, conference.
Thank you. Well done.
Well done, you guys.
Delegates, I'll give people a few minutes